Malaysia is a country that is very important to Australia. It's our 12th largest trading partner. It's a country that is similar to us in size. It has been a stable place, one of Southeast Asia's more stable places, at least since 1969. But when you ask most Australians about Malaysia, they will tend to think of some negative things. It may be the hanging of convicted drug traffickers or diplomatic incidents over a particular TV series, and of course there's the word recalcitrant. But I think beyond those issues, most people don't really think about Malaysia very much, and it's a pity because it is much more important than the level of attention it gets would suggest. We're very pleased to have with us today Barry Wain, an Australian writer who's based in Singapore and who has just written an important book on Malaysia and in particular the role that Dr. Mahathir has played in the development of modern Malaysia and where Malaysia is today. This has become a bestseller in Singapore, even though the Straits Times won't publish a review of it. And Barry tells me that it has become a very hot topic on blog sites in Malaysia. And even further, apparently Dr. Mahathir himself has blogged twice on Barry's book. So I don't think you could have a much better response, if you like. I think, Barry, he's reserved the right to sue you, I think, in one of those blog posts. So it could be better in that sense. But without further ado, I'd like you to join me in welcoming Barry Wain to the Lowy Institute.
Thanks very much for the introduction, Michael, and for the plug for my book. Unfortunately, apparently, my publisher hasn't sent over the flyers, which were supposed to be distributed on the way out to encourage you to buy them. But nevertheless, I think what you say, Michael, is quite right, that Malaysia is overlooked to a certain extent, and it's not the most important country in Southeast Asia, and I think recently the developments in neighbouring countries, the positive developments in Indonesia and the much more negative developments in Thailand tended to overshadow Malaysia. I think without those events, a lot more attention would have been paid to Malaysia because things have not been going very well there in recent times. Unless you follow the country closely, you're undoubtedly shocked by reports of Christian churches being firebombed and vandalised last month after a seemingly perplexing dispute over the use of the word Allah. No fewer than 11 churches were attacked. To make matters worse, a Sikh temple, 3 mosques and a couple of suraus, which are prayer rooms, were struck apparently in retaliation. The news was shocking because Malaysia enjoys a fairly favourable international image as a peaceful, tropical and rather exotic country. It's been one of the success stories from the wave of decolonisation following World War II. The World Bank included Malaysia as part of East Asia's economic miracle in a landmark report in 1993. Malaysia was a founding member in 1967 of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, and has been an active participant in other regional and global organisations. Except for the racial riots that erupted 40 years ago that Michael referred to in 1969, Malaysia has often seemed like a model, multi-ethnic, multi-religious country with sizable Chinese and Indian communities living in harmony with the majority Malays. Bequeathed solid foundations, if a difficult racial mix, by the departing British colonial administration in 1957, Malaysia has been on nobody's list of trouble spots in an often turbulent world. In the wake of the 9/11 terrorist attacks in the United States, President George W. Bush reached out to Malaysia when looking for moderate Muslim leaders. So Australians with an historical view of Malaysia as a friendly neighbour in Southeast Asia are rightly puzzled. As one recent commentary here put it, what's happening with Malaysia? The government contended that these unprecedented attacks were isolated, the work of only a few individuals and not organised by any group. Without necessarily disputing that, and it's worth noting that 10 people have been charged, including 3 juveniles, I believe these attacks nevertheless reflect a deep crisis at the heart of Malaysian politics. Behind Malaysia's well-deserved image of tolerance and moderation, conditions generally have been deteriorating for a long time. Malaysia is beset with structural problems, mostly stemming from the domination of the country for more than half a century by the United Malays National Organisation, known as UMNO, in coalition with essentially the same political partners. Once an idealistic party that campaigned successfully for independence, UMNO now is little more than a vehicle to dispense patronage to well-connected Malaysians. The recent violence exposing deepening ethno-religious divisions in Malaysian society mocks the efforts of Prime Minister Najib Razak, who has made the rallying cry in his first year in office, "One Malaysia." He will need to show considerably more political resolve and leadership if he is to realise his ambition of leading an inclusive and united country. Having just written the book on Mahathir that Michael mentioned, Mahathir, who ruled in fairly authoritarian fashion for 22 years before retiring in 2003, I can say with some confidence that it's Dr. Mahathir himself who is largely responsible for Malaysia's gloomy immediate outlook. While Dr. Mahathir did not invent the ills that afflict Malaysia, many of them spread and became deeply entrenched on his long watch. And though he has been gone for 6 years now, his 2 successors have made almost no headway in undoing the damage, and in some instances have aggravated it. I don't mean to suggest that Dr. Mahathir was an unqualified disaster as Malaysia's leader. In fact, his domestic track record includes extremes of success and failure, on top of the fact that he gave relatively small Malaysia middle power clout and brand name recognition worldwide. To meet his obsession with turning Malaysia into a modern, fully developed and respected nation, Dr. Mahathir built impressive physical infrastructure: highways, ports, dams, airports, soaring commercial blocks, and pursued breakneck growth. He engineered a socio-economic transformation. That's someone from UMNO, Michael, is objecting to something I'm about to say. Dr. Mahathir engineered a socio-economic transformation, lessening Malaysia's dependence on commodities and deepening its industrialisation. Under his constant prodding, Malaysia became one of the developing world's most successful economies, a favourite destination of foreign investment, an export dynamo. A striking reduction in poverty and increasing affluence gave Malaysia the look and feel of a sophisticated, prosperous country with a greatly expanded middle class that included a significant number of Malays. But there was a dark side to this go-go growth. Unwilling to tolerate dissent, Dr. Mahathir eliminated rivals in UMNO and repressed the political opposition as well as civil society critics. Viewing some state institutions as rival centres of power, he emasculated them so he would meet no obstruction. In head-on confrontations, he subdued both the judiciary and the monarchy, damaging Malaysia's separation of powers doctrine. Dr. Mahathir combined a vigorous privatisation program with Malaysia's affirmative action policy, which channels extensive economic benefits to native peoples known as Bumiputras, predominantly Malays. He intervened personally to select Malay business executives to become role models for their community, handing them large chunks of the privatised economy to get started. He also took UMNO into business in a massive way, so that often it was party stalwarts, rather than the poor, who benefited most from affirmative action. Corruption and cronyism were hallmarks of the Mahathir era. Money politics, as it is called in Malaysia, held sway. UMNO membership became an avenue to riches. Ever larger amounts of money, millions, were poured into party and general elections to secure positions with access to tenders, licences and subsidies. Party leaders in turn directed largesse back to their supporters to maintain their posts. There was, and still is, a price on nearly every post in UMNO. It's an investment. You invest in a leader at national, divisional or branch level and you expect an appropriate return. While Dr. Mahathir more than once shed tears in public about vote buying in UMNO elections, he failed to stop it. His presidency saw the final culmination of a transition from an UMNO of humble, self-sacrificing peasants and school teachers to a party of self-serving corporate chieftains and deal makers. Although he had more than 2 decades on top, Dr. Mahathir failed to provide for the future leadership of Malaysia. He sidelined the 3 men, Tunku Razali Hamza, a former finance minister, Musa Hitam, one of his deputy prime ministers, and Anwar Ibrahim, another of his deputy prime ministers, who would have made capable leaders, and his long tenure blocked the ascendancy of others with leadership potential. Dr. Mahathir's attempts to undercut the opposition party Islam using religion had serious and lasting consequences. By choosing to fight Islam with more Islam, he pushed Malaysia in a conservative, illiberal direction that ultimately was at odds with the process of modernisation he was seeking to promote. Fatefully, in 1988, he amended the Constitution to raise Sharia courts to co-equal status with the civil law courts, a decision that still causes anguish in families physically split by religion, and accelerated a process that has been called creeping Islamisation. UMNO is in long-term decline. After losing support among Malays for more than a decade, notwithstanding a dramatic spike in the party's popularity in 2004, which proved temporary, non-Malays are increasingly reluctant to back the 12 other parties in the ruling coalition known as the National Front, especially those representing Chinese and Indian minorities, because they are clearly subservient to UMNO, and frankly, they've almost fallen apart. It is doubtful if the National Front will be viable much longer without a major overhaul. Like other countries, Malaysia is struggling to overcome the results of last year's global economic meltdown. But on top of that, the government must address the extremely sensitive issue of affirmative action, which is now regarded as an entitlement by many beneficiaries, but which has become a major encumbrance on the entire country. It limits Malaysia's ability to compete with regional powerhouses China and India, and is leaving the poorest Malaysians behind. Nonetheless, the drubbing the National Front government suffered in a general election in 2008 took almost everyone by surprise. 3 opposition parties, brought into an alliance by Anwar Ibrahim, the charismatic former Deputy Premier and Finance Minister, won enough seats in Parliament for the first time to deny the government its customary 2/3 majority that has enabled it to change the constitution at whim. The opposition also took control of 5 of Malaysia's 13 state governments, including economic powers Selangor and Penang. Significant numbers of disaffected Malaysians crossed ethnic lines to vote for candidates promising reform. In any country that aspires to be democratic, the emergence of a credible opposition should be welcome. But UMNO has reacted badly, even harshly, to the setback. Faced with the possibility of defeat at the next election, due in 2013, the party has concentrated on sabotaging the opposition. Like the rerun of a bad movie, Anwar was promptly arrested and charged again with sodomy. Few independent observers, Malaysian or international, believe his trial, which began last week, is anything but political. The same old dirty tricks to remove Anwar from politics, as an Amnesty International official put it. Instead of undertaking the reforms that would freshen its electoral appeal, UMNO has resorted to strong-arm tactics and time-honoured appeals to Malay anxieties. In the words of Tunku Razali Hamza, an UMNO veteran and the former finance minister I mentioned, quote, "It's about putting fear into the minds of the people," unquote. UMNO has harped on the possible loss of what is known as Ketuhanan Melayu, Malay supremacy, including the manipulation of Islam, which is an important element in Malay identity. Last month's Allah issue is a classic example. On New Year's Eve, the Malaysian High Court ruled that Roman Catholics could use Allah to mean God in their local Malay language newspaper. The ruling was widely seen as a victory for Chinese, Indian and indigenous minorities. Although the court within days suspended its judgment to allow a government appeal against the ruling to be heard, large numbers of Malaysian Muslims, mostly Malays, signed protest petitions and made preparations to hold rallies. The Malaysian government rarely tolerates political demonstrations, but it tacitly approved the protests set to coincide with Friday prayers on January the 8th. Despite rising tension, Prime Minister Najib said Muslim groups were free to express their views on the Allah issue as long as the rally stayed within bounds. Arsonists began attacking churches late that evening. As Malaysian political commentator Karim Razlin wrote recently, the country's political landscape is in the process of being redrawn as UMNO, once the arbiter of middle-of-the-road Malay decency, lurches towards an atavistic and extremist future. Despite Najib's relative youth, he was 55 when he became Prime Minister last April, he is an UMNO insider and not a natural reformer. The son of Malaysia's second Premier, Tun Razak Hussein, Najib has been in politics since he was 22 and a member of the cabinet since he was 32. As one of his close associates told me, Najib is not only part of the system, he is the system. In his first 10 months in office, Najib has talked reform about reducing corruption, improving economic efficiency, and making his government more accountable. With the exception of some limited economic measures, however, it has been what Malaysians call NATO, no action, talk only. Malaysians have heard it all before, from Najib's predecessor, Abdullah Badawi, who won a huge mandate in 2004 by promising reform, and being hit by a so-called political tsunami in 2008 when he failed to deliver. The problem might be resolved if the opposition won power, taking over the government for a term or two, while UMNO and the National Front rejuvenated themselves in the political wilderness. But the Malaysian opposition, which raised popular expectations with its psychological victory almost 2 years ago, has disappointed many people. With the unlikely allies, the overwhelmingly Malay Party Islam, the predominantly Chinese Democratic Action Party, and Anwar's multiracial People's Justice Party, have managed to, have managed to hammer out a common platform, they've found it very difficult to cooperate. The People's Front, as it calls itself, has tarnished its reputation by also engaging in dispiriting politicking instead of trying to prove itself worthy of a shot at office. Anwar undermined his own standing by setting a deadline for enough government MPs to cross the floor of Parliament to enable the People's Front to take over without waiting for the next election. In the event, none crossed. Instead, the National Front enticed enough defectors from Anwar's ranks to switch sides to recapture Perak, resulting in violence in the state legislature as some members of the elected government resisted eviction. The performance of the People's Front in administering the states it won in 2008 also has been less than stellar. Part of it is due to their inexperience and incompetence, and part a result of the states' limited powers and resources. For example, the 13 states between them get a mere 9% of the federal budget, and they can't raise funds in their own name. Given these realities, the People's Front administrations would have been well advised to knuckle down and show their determination and commitment rather than grandstanding and inevitably coming up short. Then there is the towering issue of Anwar's leadership. It cannot be assumed Anwar will walk free merely because the trial is politically motivated. He spent years in jail a decade ago before eventually being cleared of sodomy charges by Malaysian courts. Were he to be convicted, he would almost certainly be jailed again for years, depriving the People's Front of its one inspirational leader who seems capable of holding the three parties together. The bottom line is that Malaysia's prospects are extremely uncertain. I am not persuaded that Najib is either able or willing to make the reforms that will enable Malaysia to maintain its place in a highly competitive, globalised world, but UMNO may still manage to hang on. The ideal would be the consolidation of a two-party system, but just now, stalemate or upheaval seems more likely. Thank you.
We'll take some questions. Ladies and gentlemen, Barry has agreed to take some questions from the floor. So, if you'd like to ask a question, please raise your hand, and a microphone will come to you. Yes, just.
Barry, very interesting. I presume you now live in Australia and are not going back.
No, I live in Singapore and I'm continuing to work and write there. And the Malaysian government hasn't made a decision about the book yet. The Home Ministry said it needed 60 days to decide whether it should be fit for sale, and at the end of 60 days they say they need another 60 days. Of course, I'm offended that it should take anyone 60 days to read my book. I think it's a gripping read and can be dispensed with in a couple of days. But it's in some ways it's and certainly if it's cleared for sale, I will go there and we'll have a launch there and. At several places, I expect, in the country. If they ban it, it's a very strange state of affairs. In fact, it's full of irony because in 1970, after Dr. Mahathir lost his own seat as a backbencher after the election, in the elections that preceded the riots, he wrote a very famous book called The Malay Dilemma, which was immediately banned in Malaysia. But of course it was available in Singapore. The same is true of my book, but so far mine hasn't been banned in Malaysia. Malaysians are continuing to buy the book in Singapore. If my book is banned in Malaysia, I hope Malaysians will even buy it in greater numbers in Singapore, so I will probably do some speaking possibly in Malaysia to support that as well.
Alison Bronowski-Barry. Two questions. If we can't get your book here, can you suggest, is Amazon the best thing? That's question one. Question two, Graham Dobell said on the Lowy Institute blog that you had, in the book, made a very interesting revelation, I think it's a revelation for most of us at least, that Dr. Mahathir had, in his early years as Prime Minister, signed a secret agreement with the United States about the United States being committed to the defence of Malaysia, something that is news to me, I must say. And could you fill us in a little bit on that? Thank you.
The book is available in Australia, and I advise everyone to buy it in bookshops and not to buy it online with Amazon or anyone else. There's a particular reason that's complicated. I won't go into it, but it's released outside Hong Kong, Southeast Asia and Australia. It's released as an academic book and it's priced accordingly, very, very expensively, whereas in Australia you can buy it for $45 and that's a reasonable price for a hardcover book. So very strongly I've urged all my friends, don't buy it online unless there's some special deal in Australia, but it should become available in the bookshops now. As I say, the flyers were supposed to come over today for order forms were supposed to come today and they just apparently didn't turn up. Yes, you're referring to, of course, Dr. Mahathir was fairly famous for telling the Americans where to get off, of course, a lot of the Western world as well, but he particularly picked on the Americans and over the presence of the 7th Fleet in Asia. And to hear him talk, of course, you would think that he was totally, he wasn't totally anti-American at all. Of course, he welcomed foreign investment and American investment, but you think he was totally anti the presence of the American military. And in fact, what I discovered was that in 1984, just a couple of years after he took power, he visited the United States and spoke to the Reagan administration. And while he was there, he signed an agreement, he entered an agreement that's not a formal military pact, but it's a very serious security agreement, and with Caspar Weinberger. I discussed it with Mahathir, who readily agreed that this was so. And it provided for extensive contacts between the Malaysian military and the American military. It allowed the Americans, for instance, to train access to the jungle warfare training school in Johor. It allowed for ship visits. It allowed for joint exercises. To this day, the Malaysian public has never been told about this agreement, which is still in power, and it's the reason why there's been a lot of Americans in uniform in Malaysia over the years. One of the better reviews, or thing that I was interested in, was that a former reporter, an American reporter who was based in KL, wrote a review of my book, and he started off with an anecdote. He said in 1984 or 1985, a friend reported seeing American troops in uniform in a 2.5-ton truck up in the back blocks of Malaysia. So he said, I went to the American embassy and asked them, and they looked blankly at me. And I went to the Malaysian Defence Ministry, and they looked blankly at me. now I've read the book, I know it wasn't, someone wasn't smoking dope, they weren't hallucinating, they really were there. When I spoke to Dr. Mahadi about it, he said it's just simply, my military thought it was worthwhile to do it, and he said, I didn't think there was any problem about keeping it quiet, and he said furthermore, it's just the same sort of arrangement that America has with other friendly countries. In fact, what I was able to uncover is that the Americans regarded it basically as the template for future agreements with other countries. They were able to, the deal they got was so cooperative from Malaysia, they were extremely pleased with it. And that is one, and I hope that when the book becomes available, these issues will be discussed more widely in Malaysia.